The Great Plains in winter become something other than Earth. They transform into a place where the sky descends to meet the ground, where breath freezes before it leaves your lips, and where the wind carries not just cold, but a kind of ancient, patient hunger. Tonight, we drift backward through time to the Dakota Territory of the late 1800s, to a landscape so vast and exposed that winter didn't just arrive, it consumed everything. This is not a story of grand battles or momentous decisions, but of ordinary people facing something far more relentless, the quiet, daily struggle against a season that could erase you from existence in minutes. Before we step into this hushed journey through winter's iron grip on the northern frontier, I wonder, could you do something small for me? If you'd like more of these quiet passages through forgotten history, consider tapping the like button and subscribing to Epic Boring History, so these late-night stories will always find you when you need them most. I'm curious too, where are you right now and what hour claims you? Perhaps you're tucked into the small hours of night, or maybe dawn is just breaking where you are, or you've found yourself in that strange, in-between time that belongs to neither day nor darkness. Now, if you'd like, dim whatever lights surround you. Maybe let a fan hum softly in the background, that white noise that soothes the edges of thought. Let's begin our slow descent into a winter that shaped lives, carved history into frozen ground, and taught a hard lesson about what it means simply to survive. The Dakota Territory stretched endlessly in every direction, a sea of grass that in summer rolled like water, and in winter became something else entirely, a white void where distance lost all meaning. If you stood on this land in the 1870s or 1880s, you might scan the horizon for an hour and see nothing but the faint line where earth met sky, and even that line could vanish when the snow began to fall. You arrived here perhaps with a land claim and a handful of tools, drawn by the promise of free acres under the Homestead Act. The government offered 160 acres to anyone willing to prove up the land, to build, to plow, to stay for 5 years. What they didn't tell you in the land office back east, what you couldn't know until you lived it, was that winter here didn't behave like winter in Ohio or Pennsylvania or even Illinois. Winter on the Dakota Plains was a different creature altogether, one that arrived without warning and stayed until it had taken its share of lives. Your first task that first autumn was to build some kind of shelter before the snow came. If you had money, you might haul logs from the distant Missouri River and construct a small cabin, chinked with mud and grass. More likely, though, you built what was called a soddy, a house cut from the very earth itself. You'd plow long strips of prairie sod thick with roots and stack these heavy bricks into walls 3 feet deep. The roof was more sod laid over cottonwood poles if you could find them, or over nothing but braided grass. When rain fell, mud dripped through for days afterward. But sod had one great virtue. It held heat better than anything else you could build with your own hands. Those 3-foot walls became your fortress against wind that could strip warmth from wood in minutes. Inside this single room, perhaps 14 feet by 16 feet, your entire life unfolded. You cooked, ate, slept, gave birth, nursed sickness, and sometimes buried the dead, all within walls that smelled perpetually of damp earth and smoke. The floor was dirt, packed hard by footsteps but never quite dry. In winter, frost crept up from below, and you'd wake to find the potatoes you'd buried in the corner frozen solid despite being indoors. One small window, if you were fortunate enough to have real glass, let in weak light. More often, you'd stretched greased paper across a frame, which glowed dimly when the sun struck it, but gave you no view of the world outside. At night, a single lantern or tallow candle pushed back the darkness, but fuel was precious, so mostly you sat in dimness, waiting for sleep. Your eyes adjusted to the perpetual gloom until you almost forgot what bright light looked like. The furniture was spare, a table built from whatever scraps you'd hauled in the wagon, chairs if you were lucky, more often just stools or upturned crates. The bed was a frame strung with rope, topped with a cornhusk mattress that rustled with every movement and provided thin comfort against the cold that seeped up through the floor. You hung blankets from the ceiling to divide the space, giving some small illusion of privacy, but sound carried easily, and in winter, when you sealed every crack against the wind, the air grew thick with the smell of bodies, food, chamber pots, and the kerosene that stung your eyes. Children slept 3 or 4 to a bed, pressed together for warmth. Infants were wrapped so tightly they could barely move, tucked between parents who feared the baby would work free of the blankets in the night and freeze before morning. The stove, a small cast-iron box if you'd hauled one west, or a makeshift firebox built from stones, occupied the center of everything. Every activity in the house oriented around it. Cooking, of course, but also washing, the only spot where ice could be melted into water, the only source of heat that made the difference between surviving and not. Feeding that stove became the rhythm of your days. Wood was scarce on the treeless prairie, so you learned to burn what the land provided, twisted grass, bundled tight, which burned hot and fast. More commonly, you burned buffalo chips, dry dung that littered the plains in enormous quantities before the herds disappeared. You'd send children out with gunny sacks to gather these flat, sun-dried discs which burned slow and steady though they filled the soddy with a peculiar, musty smoke. Later, when the buffalo were gone, you burned cow chips, twisted hay, even corn cobs. Anything that would produce heat. But fuel gathering took time and effort, and winter days were short. You learned to ration warmth the way you rationed food, letting the fire die down at night, huddling under every quilt and blanket you owned, breathing into your pillow to create a small pocket of warmth around your face. Morning came late in winter, the sun reluctant to rise, and when it did, it hung pale and distant, offering light but little warmth. You woke to a room so cold that frost coated the inside of the walls, beautiful crystalline patterns that would have been lovely if they didn't represent heat escaping through every microscopic gap in your shelter. Your breath plumed white in the dimness. The water bucket had frozen solid overnight, as it did every night once deep winter set in, leaving you to chip ice into a pot and melt it over the rekindled fire before you could have even a cup of water to drink. Getting out of bed required a kind of courage, a mental preparation. You'd lie there, gathering yourself, knowing that the moment you threw back the blankets, cold would envelop you like falling into a winter river. Then you'd move quickly, feet hitting the frozen floor, a gasp at the shock of it, rushing to the stove where last night's embers might still hold a spark of warmth. You'd coax these embers with dried grass, blowing gently, nursing them back to flame, your hands trembling with cold and urgency. Once the fire caught, you'd hover over it, letting heat soak into your body before attempting anything else. This ritual, this slow warming, could take an hour on the coldest mornings. Your clothing in winter became a kind of armor, layer upon layer. Next to your skin you wore wool or cotton undergarments, changed rarely, because washing and drying clothes in winter was nearly impossible. Over that, more wool, a shirt, a vest, a jacket, sometimes 2 jackets if you were heading outside. Your best jacket would be patched at the elbows and cuffs, the fabric thin where it had rubbed for years, but you kept it because wool, even worn wool, was the only thing that kept you from freezing. If you were fortunate, or if you'd been wise enough to trade for it early, you owned a buffalo robe, a massive, heavy hide, with the fur still on, worn with the fur inside against your body. These robes were cumbersome, weighing perhaps 30 pounds, but they held warmth like nothing else, and men had been known to survive blizzards by wrapping themselves entirely in buffalo robes and letting the snow bury them until the storm passed. But buffalo were vanishing from the plains, hunted to near extinction, and by the 1880s such robes were increasingly rare. You made do with what you had, a coat of pieced-together wool, oiled to shed snow, though the oil stank and left dark stains. Your hands suffered most. Gloves were thin, or you had none at all, just rags wrapped around your fingers. Heavy work, and all work was heavy, required dexterity, so you often worked bare-handed, accepting the pain of cold, the way your fingers would go numb, then ache with a deep, burning sensation as circulation struggled against the temperature. Frostbite came easily. At first, you'd feel the warning signs, tingling, numbness, skin turning pale. If you caught it early, you could warm the affected area slowly, never quickly, because that caused worse damage, and recover with nothing more than pain. But if you didn't catch it, or if you had no choice but to keep working, because the livestock needed tending, or the roof was collapsing under snow, then the frostbite deepened. Your fingers or toes would turn waxy white, then grayish, and finally black as the tissue died. You'd heard stories of men losing fingers, toes, sometimes entire feet to frostbite. You'd seen it yourself, your neighbor's left hand with only a thumb and one finger remaining, the others taken by a winter storm 5 years back when he'd gotten lost, walking from barn to house and spent 4 hours searching for his own front door in a whiteout. Your feet fared little better. Boots were expensive, and most settlers wore whatever they'd brought from back east, leather boots designed for milder climates, not for walking through snow that could be 3 feet deep and temperatures that could drop to 40 below zero. You'd stuff your boots with straw or paper for insulation, but moisture from sweat would dampen it, and dampness drew cold. Your feet would go numb within an hour of being outside, and you'd hobble through your chores, unable to feel whether you were walking properly, trusting to habit and balance. At night, you'd pull off your boots to find your stockings frozen to your skin, ice crystals formed from sweat. You'd warm your feet by the stove, and the returning sensation was excruciating. Pins and needles that made you gasp and sometimes cry, though you did so quietly, not wanting to alarm the children. The children themselves suffered in ways that broke your heart. They needed to play, to move, to burn the energy that youth demands. But winter made prisoners of you all. They'd cluster near the stove, bored and restless, fighting with each other over nothing. You'd try to keep them occupied, teaching letters, telling stories, setting them to small tasks like carding wool or shelling dried beans. But children need more than dim rooms and quiet voices. They needed sunlight, fresh air, space to run, and winter withheld all of these things. When the weather permitted, when the wind died down and the temperature rose above zero, you'd send them outside for brief periods, bundled until they could barely move. They'd return with red cheeks and snow in their hair, briefly revitalized, but such days were rare, and you learned not to risk it, because the weather could change without warning, and children who wandered even 50 feet from the house could become lost in minutes if a storm rolled in. Food in winter followed a monotonous pattern. You'd spent autumn desperately preserving anything you could, potatoes and turnips buried in a pit outside, covered with straw and earth, carrots packed in sand in the coolest corner of the soddy, cabbage hung from the rafters, dried beans and corn in sacks suspended from the ceiling to keep them away from mice. Flour, if you could afford it, became the measure of your security. You'd bought as much as possible before winter set in, 50 or 100-pound sacks that you stored carefully, checking for weevils, knowing that this flour would determine whether you ate bread or went without. Meat was scarce. If you'd managed to slaughter a pig or cow before winter, you'd have salted or smoked some of it, but most settlers couldn't afford livestock beyond a single milk cow and a few chickens. The chickens stopped laying in winter, their bodies conserving energy against the cold. Your cow, if you had one, produced less milk, and you guarded her fiercely, because losing her would mean losing your only reliable source of protein and fat. You'd hunt if you could, trudging through snow after rabbits or prairie chickens, but game was scarce in deep winter, and spending hours outside for the sake of one thin rabbit often wasn't worth the risk. More often, you made do with what you had: beans boiled with salt pork, cornbread, maybe dried apple slices if you'd managed to preserve some. Coffee was a luxury most couldn't afford, so you drank substitutes: roasted grain, chicory, or just hot water, flavored with a bit of molasses if you had any. The children drank milk when there was milk, water otherwise. Scurvy crept into your life by late winter, though you might not have known that's what it was. Your gums would bleed when you chewed, your joints would ache, exhaustion would settle over you like a blanket. The lack of fresh food, of anything green, of fruit or vegetables, slowly depleted your body. You'd seen settlers emerge from winter with teeth loose in their heads, with wounds that wouldn't heal, with a weakness that persisted long into spring. Cooking itself was a challenge. The stove was small, the fuel unpredictable. You'd mix cornmeal with water and salt, spread it thin on a pan, and bake it into hard cakes that kept for days. You'd boil beans for hours, precious fuel, but beans wouldn't soften any other way. You'd render every scrap of fat, saving it in jars, because fat meant flavor and calories, and both were desperately needed. Meals were communal by necessity, everyone eating from the pot with spoons or their fingers, no ceremony, just the basic need to fill stomachs. The food was rarely tasty, salt and grease were your only seasonings, but you ate it without complaint because not eating wasn't an option. Children sometimes cried from hunger, especially late in winter when supplies ran low. You'd give them the last of the bread, water it down so it seemed like more, tell them stories to distract from the emptiness in their bellies. You yourself would go to bed hungry more often than not, telling yourself you'd eat tomorrow, saving portions for the children, for your wife, if you were the husband, for your husband, if you were the wife, each trying to spare the other without saying so. The work, despite the cold, never stopped. Every day brought tasks that couldn't be postponed. The livestock needed feeding, the cow needed milking, ice had to be hauled from the creek or melted from snow. The endless battle against the cold had to be fought and re-fought. You'd dress in your layers, steel yourself, and push out the door into wind that stole your breath. The air at 20 below zero burned your lungs, each breath a small agony that you learned to manage by breathing through a scarf wrapped around your face. The barn, if you'd built one, or more likely just a lean-to of stacked hay and poles, stood perhaps 30 or 40 yards from the house. On a clear day, you could see it easily, but clear days were rare once winter truly settled. More often you'd step outside into a world erased by blowing snow. The wind drove snow horizontally, stinging any exposed skin, filling your eyes so you had to squint to see anything at all. And in those conditions, that 30-yard walk became treacherous. You'd heard the stories, men who left their houses to tend animals and were found frozen 100 yards away, disoriented, lost, dying within sight of their own homes. So you took precautions. Many settlers strung rope between house and barn, a lifeline you could grip and follow even when you couldn't see your own feet. You'd grasp that rope and haul yourself along it, hand over hand, snow piling on your shoulders until you felt the barn wall and knew you'd made it. Inside the barn, barely warmer than outside, just out of the wind, your animals stood in their own frozen breath. The cow's water had to be broken free of ice, her feed carefully rationed from the hay pile that had to last until spring. You'd milk her with stiff fingers, the milk steaming in the cold air, and you'd carry the bucket back to the house, careful not to spill, because spilled milk would freeze before it hit the ground. Sometimes the milk froze in the bucket on the walk back, turning to slush that had to be melted by the stove. Chickens, if you kept them, huddled together in boxes lined with straw. You'd check for eggs, rarely finding any, and refresh their feed, trying to keep them alive through the winter because chickens in spring would mean eggs again, a small resurrection of plenty. The monotony of these tasks, repeated day after day, week after week, month after month, wore on you in ways that had nothing to do with physical exhaustion. It was the sameness, the unchanging routine, the lack of any break or variety that ground you down. Days blended into weeks without distinction. Sunday might mean a brief prayer, read from a worn Bible, or, if the weather allowed, a gathering with neighbors at someone's house for a service, led by whoever felt called to lead it. But often, winter made such gatherings impossible, and Sunday became just another day of survival, indistinguishable from Saturday or Tuesday. Time lost its markers, became a slow river you floated on without reference points. The isolation deepened everything. Your nearest neighbor might be 3 miles away, a distance that in summer was an easy walk but in winter became nearly impassable. You'd go weeks without seeing another soul outside your immediate family. The silence of the prairie in winter, broken only by wind and the occasional cry of a crow, became oppressive, a weight you felt in your chest. Conversations with your spouse or children grew strained, thin. You'd said everything there was to say weeks ago, and now you existed together in a kind of suspended animation, waiting for winter to release its grip. Arguments erupted over nothing, the way someone chewed, a child's whining, a forgotten chore. The small space magnified every irritation, and with no escape, no way to walk away and cool your temper, tensions festered. You'd seen families destroyed by winter, not by death, though that happened too, but by the slow corrosion of confinement, by the madness that could creep into a person's mind when there was nothing to look at but the same 4 walls, the same faces, the same endless whiteness outside. Some men and women simply broke. You'd hear of it come spring. A woman found raving in the snow trying to walk back to Iowa, convinced she could make it if she just kept walking. A man who refused to speak for months, sitting by the stove with empty eyes. Children who'd stopped playing, stopped talking, just sat with their hands in their laps, staring at nothing. The darkness compounded it. Daylight in winter was brief, perhaps 8 hours at the solstice, and much of that was dim, the sun weak and distant, the light filtered through clouds and blowing snow. You'd wake in darkness, do your morning chores in semi-darkness, and by 4 in the afternoon, darkness was descending again. Living by lantern light strained your eyes and depressed your spirits, but there was no alternative except sleep. And sleep, at least, was an escape. You'd go to bed as early as feasible, sometimes directly after supper, because being asleep was better than being awake in the cold and dark. But sleep in winter came fitfully. The cold woke you, or the wind, or the cry of a child. You'd lie awake listening to the house creak and groan, wondering if the roof would hold, if the storm battering the walls would finally find its way inside. Fear lived with you, unnamed and unspoken most of the time, but always present. Fear that supplies would run out, that someone would fall sick, that a fire would start and burn everything, your house, your possessions, your family. Fire was perhaps the greatest terror, because in winter there was nowhere to go if your house burned. You'd freeze to death before you could reach help, assuming you could even find your way through a storm to a neighbor's house. So you were scrupulous about the stove, about the lantern, checking and rechecking, always aware that one mistake could end everything. And yet accidents happened. A spark from the stove catching on dried grass used for kindling, a lamp knocked over by a stumbling child, a chimney clogged with creosote bursting into flame. Sickness was the other great fear, A simple cold could turn into pneumonia in the drafty, damp soddy. Pneumonia killed efficiently, filling the lungs with fluid, drowning you slowly while your family watched helplessly. You'd nurse the sick as best you could, heating bricks to place at their feet, making broth from boiled bones, wrapping their chests in cloths soaked with whatever folk remedy you trusted. Goose grease, turpentine, camphor if you had any. But mostly, you just waited to see if they'd recover or die. There were no doctors within reach in winter, no way to send for help, no medicine beyond what you'd brought with you, or could make from prairie herbs dried the previous summer. Children were especially vulnerable. A fever that in summer might pass unremarked could kill in winter, and you'd bury small bodies in the spring when the ground thawed, because in winter the earth was as hard as iron, and you couldn't dig a proper grave. Bodies of those who died in winter were wrapped in blankets or sewn into sheets and placed outside, where the cold preserved them until spring. Sometimes you'd keep them in a shed or lean-to, out of sight but still present, a grim reminder of how thin the line was between living and not. Death had a different quality in winter, quieter, more inevitable, less dramatic than death in summer's heat or autumn's harvests. People simply stopped. Their hearts gave out, their lungs filled, their bodies exhausted by cold and hunger and the relentless effort of staying alive. You'd gather what family remained and say a prayer, promise to bury them properly come spring, and then return to the work of surviving, because survival demanded your full attention, and grief was a luxury you couldn't quite afford until winter ended. The wind was your constant companion, the voice of winter. It spoke in 100 different tones, a low moan through the chinking, a high whistle through gaps you couldn't find, a roar during storms that made the walls shake. You learned to read the wind, to know when it was merely cold and when it carried the warning of worse weather coming. A certain quality to the sound, a drop in pitch perhaps, or a shift in direction, would send you hurrying to bring in extra fuel, to check on the animals, to prepare for a storm. And the storms, when they came, redefined reality. A true Dakota blizzard was unlike anything you'd experienced back east, unlike anything you could have imagined before living through one. The sky would darken, not to black, but to a strange yellowish grey, and the wind would rise until it became a physical force, pushing against you, stealing your balance. Then the snow would come, not falling, but flying horizontally, driven by wind that reached 40, 50, 60 miles an hour. Within minutes, visibility would drop to 0. You couldn't see your hand in front of your face, couldn't tell up from down, couldn't hear anything but the scream of wind and the hiss of snow. If you were caught outside when such a storm struck, even just in the yard, even just 20 feet from your door, you could die. The wind disoriented you instantly, spun you around, and the cold sapped your strength with terrifying speed. Men had frozen to death leaning against their own houses, unable to find the door, dying with their hands pressed against the wall that should have saved them. Children sent to fetch water from the well had disappeared, found weeks later under snowdrifts, their frozen bodies still clutching empty buckets. So when a storm threatened, you stayed inside. You made sure you had fuel for the stove, food for at least a few days, and you settled in to wait because there was nothing else you could do. The storm would rage for hours, sometimes for days. Snow would pile against the walls, drifting up to the roof, burying the windows. The house would grow dark even at midday, the light blocked by snow, and you'd live by lantern light, rationing it, trying to stay calm while the wind shrieked its fury. Sometimes the snow found its way inside, despite your best efforts. Fine powder sifting through gaps you couldn't see, forming little drifts in the corners of the room, melting near the stove, and turning to puddles you'd have to mop up with rags. When the storm finally passed, you'd dig your way out, literally pushing against the door until you'd cleared enough snow to open it, then shoveling a path to the barn, to the well, to anything you needed to reach. The world outside would be transformed. Drifts 6, 8, 10 feet high, sculpted by the wind into strange shapes, hard-packed and smooth. Walking on these drifts was sometimes possible, the snow so hard it supported your weight, and other times treacherous, the surface collapsing under you, plunging you into soft snow that swallowed you to your waist or chest. Digging out from a major blizzard could take days, and while you dug, you worried about the next storm, because they came in waves and you might have only a day or two of calm before the sky darkened again. The weight of snow on your sod roof was a constant concern. Sod was heavy to begin with, and snow added more weight, tons of it if the storm was large enough. You'd climb up, risky in itself, and try to shovel some of it off, but it was exhausting work, and you couldn't remove it all. Some roofs collapsed, burying families inside. You'd hear of it come spring, a whole family suffocated or crushed when their soddy caved in during a February storm, the neighbors not finding the bodies until the snow melted in April. Your own roof groaned and creaked under the load, and you'd lie awake listening to it, wondering if this night would be the night it gave way, and where you could possibly go if it did. But mostly, it held. Mostly, you survived another storm, another week, another month. And that was the essential truth of being a settler in the Dakota winters. Survival was not a triumph, not a victory to celebrate, but simply a fact that had to be repeated day after day until spring finally came and released you. Spring seemed impossibly distant in January or February, a half-remembered dream from another life. You tried to recall what warmth felt like, what green grass looked like, the smell of earth thawing, and you couldn't quite manage it. Winter had erased those memories, replaced them with cold and white and endless wind. But you endured because there was no choice, and because buried somewhere under the exhaustion and fear and hunger was the hope that this land, once winter passed, would give you something better, a harvest, a future, a life that justified all this suffering. For now, though, there was only the next day, the next storm, the next small task that kept you alive. You fed the stove, you melted snow for water, you rationed the beans and flour, and you waited. The rhythm of your days became the rhythm of winter itself, slow, repetitive, heavy with silence and cold. You moved through these days like a sleepwalker, conserving energy, speaking little, doing what had to be done, and nothing more. Time stretched and compressed strangely. A morning could last forever, and a week could vanish without notice. The sameness made it impossible to remember. Had you already mended that tear in your coat, or was that last week? When had you last seen the neighbor? Was it a month ago, or 2 months? You marked the passage of time by the level of flour in the barrel, by the shrinking pile of fuel, by the slow arc of the sun that rose a little earlier each week, even as winter maintained its grip. These were your calendars, more reliable than memory, more honest than hope. January of 1888 began quietly on the northern plains, cold but not unbearably so, the kind of cold that settlers had learned to live with. The first weeks of the month passed without incident, each day a repetition of the one before. Morning chores, huddled hours by the stove, early darkness settling over the prairie. Then came January the 12th, a Thursday that dawned with unexpected mildness. The temperature had risen overnight into the 20s, warm enough that ice on water buckets was thin, warm enough that the wind, for once, felt almost gentle against your face. It was the kind of false spring that sometimes visited the plains in midwinter, a brief reprieve that lifted spirits and made you believe, for a few hours, that the worst might be over. Children woke to this unusual warmth and begged to go outside, to walk to school without their heavy coats, and parents, relieved by the break in the cold, allowed it. School began at 9 o'clock in the one-room schoolhouses scattered across the territory, buildings that served as both classroom and community center. That Thursday morning, children from homesteads within a 2 or 3 mile radius walked to school along familiar paths, some alone, some in small groups of siblings or neighbors. The snow underfoot had softened in the mild air, making walking easier than it had been in weeks. The sky held high clouds, pale and thin, and the sun, though weak, felt almost warm on upturned faces. Teachers, often young women from back east, barely older than their oldest students, arrived early to start fires in the schoolhouse stoves. They arranged slates and primers, mentally preparing for the day's lessons, reading, arithmetic, perhaps some geography if the older children were attentive. These teachers lived far from home, boarded with local families for a few dollars a month, and taught because teaching was one of the few respectable occupations available to unmarried women. They were responsible not just for education, but for the safety and well-being of every child who walked through their door. By mid-morning, most schoolhouses across Dakota and Nebraska and parts of Minnesota held their usual complement of students, perhaps 15, perhaps 30, ranging in age from 5 to 16. The children sat on benches, the youngest in front, the oldest in back, all facing the teacher's desk and the blackboard behind it. Lessons proceeded normally that morning. Younger children practiced their letters, sounding out words from McGuffey's reader. Older students worked arithmetic problems, scratching numbers on their slates with chalk that squeaked and left dust on their fingers. The stove ticked and settled, burning less fuel than usual because the day was mild. Some teachers even allowed windows to be opened a crack, letting fresh air into rooms that had been sealed tight for months. Around noon, children ate their dinners, cold cornbread perhaps, or a biscuit with a scrape of jam, whatever their mothers had packed that morning. Some ate quickly and asked permission to go outside, to run and play in the relative warmth, and teachers granted it, glad to see children released from the confinement that winter imposed. But while the children ate and played, far to the northwest, something was moving. A mass of Arctic air, unimaginably cold, had broken free from the frozen north and was sweeping southward across the Canadian plains at tremendous speed. This air came from regions where winter never truly ended, where temperatures routinely dropped to 50 or 60 below zero, where the very atmosphere seemed hostile to life. And it was descending on the Great Plains with a speed that defied prediction. Weather forecasting in 1888 was primitive at best. The Signal Service, precursor to the Weather Bureau, maintained scattered stations that took temperature and barometric readings, but communication was slow and the science of predicting weather was in its infancy. The meteorologists in Washington had noted the cold front, had even issued warnings, but these warnings took hours to transmit by telegraph, and they reached cities and towns, not isolated schoolhouses on the prairie. Most settlers and teachers had no warning at all. Around 1 o'clock in the afternoon, teachers who happened to glance outside began to notice a change. The sky to the north was darkening rapidly, not the gradual dimming of approaching evening, but a sudden, ominous transformation. The temperature, which had been so mild all morning, began to drop. You could feel it through the walls, a chill that seemed to arrive all at once, as if someone had opened an enormous door to a frozen room. Some teachers, sensing danger, called the children back inside immediately. Others hesitated, uncertain whether to dismiss school early and send children home while travel was still possible, or to keep them at school where they'd be safe if conditions worsened. The decision had to be made quickly, and different teachers made different choices, and these choices determined who lived and who died in the hours that followed. The storm hit with shocking speed. In some places, the temperature dropped 50 degrees in 3 minutes, from the low 20s to 30 below zero almost instantaneously. The wind rose from nothing to a howling gale in moments, going from calm to 60 miles per hour before you could draw breath. And the snow came, driven horizontally by that wind, thick and blinding, turning day into white chaos. Teachers who had kept their students inside found themselves suddenly trapped in schoolhouses that rattled and groaned under the assault. The windows, which had been opened to mild air, now leaked freezing wind, and teachers rushed to close them, to stuff rags in the cracks, to pile more fuel on the stove. Children who moments before had been restless and bored now huddled together, frightened by the sudden roar of wind, by the way the walls shook, by the darkness that descended even though it was barely afternoon. Some cried, and teachers worked to keep them calm, to project confidence even as their own hearts raced with fear. In one schoolhouse near Groton, Dakota Territory, a teacher named Minnie Freeman made the decision to keep her students inside, despite the terror she felt. The building was small and poorly built, and as the storm intensified, she could see daylight through gaps in the walls that she'd never noticed before. The stove roared with the draft from the wind, burning fuel at a rate that would exhaust their supply within hours. Minnie gathered the children, 16 of them, ranging from 6 to 14 years old, and told them stories, led them in singing, anything to keep their minds off the storm. But the building couldn't withstand the wind. Around 2 o'clock, a particularly violent gust tore part of the roof away, and snow began pouring into the schoolhouse, driven by wind that sucked the heat from the room in seconds. Minnie made a decision that would later be called heroic, though at the time it simply seemed necessary. She would lead the children to the nearest house, which she believed was perhaps a quarter-mile away. She couldn't let them freeze in a roofless building. She had the children join hands, forming a chain with herself at the front, and they stepped out into the blizzard. The cold was like a physical blow, stealing breath, burning exposed skin. Visibility was absolute zero. Minnie couldn't see the child whose hand she held, couldn't see anything but white and more white. She could only move in the direction she hoped was correct, pulling the children behind her, praying she wouldn't lose her way. They walked, or tried to walk, but the wind knocked them sideways and the snow was already deep enough to make each step a struggle. Children stumbled and fell, and Minnie had to stop to pull them up, to make sure no one had let go of the chain, because letting go meant disappearing into white and never being found. How long they walked, Minnie couldn't have said. Time lost meaning in the storm. Minutes felt like hours, and she began to fear she'd been wrong about the direction, that she was leading them all to death in the empty prairie. But somehow, miraculously, they reached a house. Minnie felt the wall before she saw it, solid and real through the blinding snow, and she found the door and pushed it open, and all 16 children collapsed inside, frost-covered and shaking, but alive. Not all teachers were so fortunate. Elsewhere, teachers who tried to dismiss school and send children home watched helplessly as students vanished into the storm within steps of the schoolhouse door. In Nebraska, near O'Neill, a teacher named Lois Royce faced her own terrible choice when the storm hit. She had 17 students, and she knew that keeping them in the schoolhouse overnight would mean certain death. The building was too cold, too drafty, and they had little fuel. She decided to try for the nearest house, about 80 rods away, less than a quarter mile. Lois tied the children together with a rope and led them out into the storm. But 80 rods in a blizzard might as well have been 80 miles. Within minutes, Lois was disoriented, unable to see anything, unable to tell if she was walking in circles or straight. The children behind her struggled against the wind, some crying, others silent with terror and cold. They wandered for hours. How many, no one could later determine. The younger children couldn't keep walking, their small bodies exhausted, and Lois had to carry them, passing them from her arms to the older children, everyone taking turns bearing the weight of those too small to go on. Eventually, they found shelter, not the house Lois had aimed for, but a hay field where they burrowed into a haystack, pulling hay around them, creating a kind of nest. There they huddled through the night, sharing body heat, barely conscious, hovering at the edge of survival. When rescuers found them the next day, Lois Royce had lost both her feet to frostbite. Several of the children had also suffered frostbite, and one, a small boy of 7, had died in the night, his body stiff and frozen despite being pressed between his siblings. Other teachers made the decision to keep their students in school, and some of these teachers managed to keep everyone alive through resourcefulness and luck. They burned furniture when the fuel ran out, desks, benches, anything that would burn. They kept children moving, leading them in exercises, in songs, in anything that would keep blood circulating and spirits up. They shared whatever food anyone had brought, parceling out biscuits and apples and hard candy, making each bite last. In one schoolhouse, the teacher had children take turns running in place by the stove, 5 minutes of exercise followed by 5 minutes of huddling under coats. In another, the teacher led endless rounds of hymns, the children's voices thin but persistent against the roar of wind. But not all stories ended in survival. In a schoolhouse near Plainview, Nebraska, a young teacher named Etta Shattuck tried to keep her students safe but couldn't maintain enough heat. The storm raged through the afternoon and into the evening, and the temperature inside the schoolhouse dropped steadily despite the fire. Children began to show signs of severe hypothermia, confusion, drowsiness, slurred speech. Etta did everything she could. She wrapped children in her own coat, in quilts that lined the walls. She held them and rubbed their hands and feet, trying to maintain circulation. But it wasn't enough. 2 of her students died that night, freezing to death inside the schoolhouse while Etta wept and prayed and kept trying to save the others. When rescuers arrived the next morning, they found her still alive, barely, cradling the frozen bodies of children she'd been unable to save. The storm didn't discriminate between schoolhouses and homes. Settlers caught outside when the blizzard struck had only minutes to find shelter before the cold overwhelmed them. In one Dakota homestead, a farmer named Johann Kaufman had been out checking on his livestock when the storm rolled in. He tried to make it back to his house, but the wind disoriented him, and he walked in circles, unable to find the building that was less than 50 yards away. His wife, watching from the window, could see him at intervals through brief clearings in the snow, a dark shape stumbling through white. But she couldn't get to him, and she couldn't make him hear her calls. She watched her husband die within sight of their home, watched him finally collapse and disappear under snow, and there was nothing she could do. Another man, caught between his barn and house, survived by killing one of his steers with a knife, gutting it, and crawling inside the carcass. The steer's body heat, fading but still present, and the shelter of the hide kept him alive through the night, though he lost several toes and part of one hand to frostbite. Children were particularly vulnerable. In one family, 2 brothers, ages 8 and 10, had been sent to fetch water from a creek 200 yards from their house. When the storm hit, they tried to return but became lost immediately. The older brother, understanding that they couldn't find their way, made a decision that probably saved his younger brother's life. He made the younger boy lie down in a slight depression, covered him with his own body, and stayed there, using himself as a shield against the wind. When their father found them hours later, the older brother was dead, frozen solid, but the younger brother beneath him was alive, hypothermic but alive, preserved by his brother's sacrifice. The father carried both boys home, the living and the dead, through snow that tried to steal them all. The storm raged through the night and into the next day in some areas, dumping additional snow and maintaining its murderous cold. By the time it finally passed, the death toll was staggering, though exact numbers were difficult to determine. Official records eventually listed over 200 dead, but many believed the true number was higher. Settlers who lived alone, who froze in their homes or barns and weren't found until spring, children who wandered from schoolhouses and disappeared under drifts that wouldn't melt until April. The storm became known as the Children's Blizzard, or the Schoolhouse Blizzard, because so many of its victims were young, caught at school when nature turned without warning. Entire communities lost children, and the grief that settled over the plains was as deep and cold as the snow itself. Funerals had to wait for spring in many cases, the ground too frozen for graves, the bodies kept in sheds or barns until the earth thawed. When the burials finally happened, months after the deaths, the grief was raw again, the wound reopened by the sight of small coffins being lowered into ground that was, at last, soft enough to receive them. The storm changed how settlers thought about winter. Before January 12, 1888, they'd respected winter's dangers, but hadn't fully understood its speed, its capacity for sudden violence. After the blizzard, they became more cautious. Rope systems between buildings became standard, not just recommended but essential. Parents stopped sending children to school in any weather that seemed questionable, keeping them home even if it meant lost education. Schools themselves changed procedures. Teachers were instructed to keep students inside if any weather threatened, to maintain supplies of food and fuel sufficient for several days, to never attempt to lead children home through a storm, no matter how close home might be. The Signal Service faced criticism for failing to provide adequate warning, though in truth, the storm had moved too fast, and communication technology was too limited for warnings to have made much difference. Still, the disaster prompted improvements in weather forecasting and communication that would eventually save lives in future storms. For the families who lost children, no improvements could undo what had happened. They lived on in their sod houses, worked their claims, survived subsequent winters, but the loss marked them permanently. You'd see it in a mother's face when snow began to fall, a tightness around her eyes, a hand that unconsciously reached for a child who was no longer there. You'd hear it in the silence of fathers who had searched through blizzards and found their children frozen, who carried that weight the rest of their lives. The blizzard became a dividing line in memory, before and after. Before the blizzard, settlers had believed that caution and hard work could protect them. After, they understood that nature on the plains didn't negotiate, didn't respect effort or virtue, simply took what it wanted. Stories of the blizzard were told and retold, each telling polishing them into something almost mythical. But underneath the myth was the raw truth, that winter in Dakota could kill you between one breath and the next, could erase you from existence while your loved ones watched helplessly from windows. Minnie Freeman, the teacher who saved her 16 students, became briefly famous. Newspapers across the country ran stories about her bravery, and songs were even written about her heroism. But Minnie herself never sought fame, never quite believed she'd done anything extraordinary. She'd simply done what seemed necessary at the moment, and the fact that it worked out, that all her students survived, seemed to her more a matter of luck than virtue. Years later, asked about that day, she would say only that she'd been terrified the entire time, convinced she was leading the children to their deaths, and that she'd prayed with every step, asking for help to find the way. The help came, or maybe it was simply chance, and either way she was grateful. Other teachers weren't so fortunate in memory. Those who lost students, even though their choices had been reasonable at the time, even though no one could have predicted the storm's ferocity, carried guilt that never fully faded. Etta Shattuck, who'd lost 2 students despite her best efforts, left teaching after that winter. She couldn't bear to stand in front of a classroom again, couldn't look at children without seeing the faces of those who died while she held them. The blizzard also revealed the randomness of survival, the way death could come to one family while sparing the next for no discernible reason. Two schoolhouses a mile apart might have vastly different outcomes, one where everyone survived, another where half the children died. And there was no satisfying explanation for the difference. It was simply the nature of the storm, of blizzards in general, capricious, arbitrary, as likely to spare the reckless as punish the cautious. This randomness troubled people more than straightforward danger would have, because it suggested that all their careful preparations, all their rules and precautions, might mean nothing when nature decided to strike. In the weeks following the blizzard, as survivors recovered and communities buried their dead, a kind of collective trauma settled over the plains. People moved more carefully, spoke more quietly, looked at the sky more often. The winter continued as winters do, but something had shifted. The settlers had been tested in a way that revealed both their fragility and their resilience, and they emerged from the experience changed, more aware of how precarious their hold on this land truly was. Children who survived the blizzard carried their own scars, some visible, missing fingers or toes, frostbite scars that whitened their skin, and some invisible. Many never fully recovered from the terror of that day, the memory of white chaos and cold, and the fear that they might never see their families again. Some refused to return to school for weeks or months, and parents didn't force them, understanding that the trauma ran deep. Others returned but sat near the door, watching the weather through the window, ready to flee at the first sign of changing skies. Teachers, too, were changed. The young women who'd come west seeking adventure and decent wages found themselves burdened with responsibilities they'd never imagined. The lives of children depending on their judgment in moments of crisis, decisions that had to be made instantly with life or death consequences. Some left teaching, went back east where winter was milder, and schools were never more than a short distance from multiple refugees. Others stayed, but they taught differently, always aware of the storm that might come, always keeping supplies ready, always watching the northern sky. The blizzard entered the mythology of the plains, joining other stories of survival and disaster that defined the region. Old-timers would reference it as a measuring stick. Cold? That's nothing compared to the schoolhouse blizzard. It became a warning and a lesson, a story parents told children to explain why they couldn't walk to school in questionable weather, why ropes had to be strung between buildings, why you never, ever ignored the signs of an approaching storm. The dead children became teachers of a sort, their deaths educating future generations about the nature of Dakota winters. But beyond the lessons and the stories, beyond even the changes in behavior and procedure, the blizzard of 1888 left something else, a deep, quiet understanding that life on the plains was held by the thinnest of threads, and that winter was always waiting to cut those threads. The land itself seemed to hold the memory. Years later, people claimed they could feel a difference in the air on January 12th, an echo of that terrible day, though whether this was real or imagined, no one could say. What was real, what remained long after the snow melted and the graves were dug and filled, was the knowledge that winter in Dakota demanded not just respect, but a kind of vigilant humility. You could do everything right, make good decisions, maintain your shelter, keep your family close, and still lose everything. This knowledge shaped the character of those who stayed, made them quieter, more careful, less inclined to boast about their conquests or achievements. They'd learned what could be taken away, and that lesson stayed with them through all the winters that followed, a cold weight carried silently through every new season of snow. Long before settlers arrived with their sod houses and single-room schoolhouses, others lived on these plains and faced the same winters. The Lakota, the Dakota, the Nakota peoples collectively known as the Sioux, had inhabited this land for generations, moving with the seasons, reading the sky and the behavior of animals, surviving through knowledge passed down through centuries. They left records of their winters, but not in the way European settlers would recognize as record-keeping. These were not written accounts in bound journals, but pictographic calendars painted or drawn on buffalo hides, elk hides, or later on cloth and paper, documents called winter counts. A winter count was a living history maintained usually by one person in a community who held the role of keeper. Each winter was marked by a single image representing the most memorable or significant event of that year, not necessarily the most important by any objective measure, but the event that stood out that would help future generations remember that particular winter and distinguish it from all the others. The images were small, simple, symbolic. A winter when many stars fell from the sky might be marked by a figure with stars around it. A winter when horses were stolen might show a horse with tracks leading away. A winter of deep snow, of terrible cold, of many deaths from freezing. These winters appeared in the counts marked by images of people lying down, of teepees heavy with snow, of figures that conveyed suffering without showing graphic detail. The exact meaning of each symbol was held in the keeper's memory and passed orally to whoever would eventually take up the role of maintaining the count. These winter counts stretch back in some cases over 200 years, creating a timeline that winds through centuries of life on the plains. They record epidemics, battles, abundant hunts, years of starvation, and winters so severe they became part of tribal memory, referenced and remembered long after everyone who experienced them had passed into death. One such winter appears in multiple counts, the winter when the snow was so deep and the cold so bitter that even the buffalo, those massive, hardy creatures perfectly adapted to plains winters, died in large numbers. The people dependent on buffalo for food, shelter, clothing and tools faced starvation. The symbol for this winter varies among different counts, but the memory is consistent, a winter that tested survival in ways that required every piece of knowledge the people possessed. Some counts mark it with a buffalo lying on its side, others with teepees surrounded by snow, still others with a figure bent against wind. The exact year of this winter is debated among scholars who study the counts, because the calendars don't correlate precisely with the European calendar system. Different keepers sometimes chose different events to mark the same year, or marked the same event in different years depending on when in the seasonal cycle they considered a new year to begin. But the winter itself, the fact of its severity, its place in collective memory, is unquestionable. It happened, and it mattered enough that multiple communities preserved the memory across generations. What the winter counts don't tell you, what they can't tell you because their compressed memory, distilled to symbol, is what it felt like to live through such winters. For that you have to imagine, to extrapolate from what is known about traditional plains life and fill in the spaces between the pictographs. Imagine a winter camp established in a river valley where cottonwoods offered some shelter from the wind and where game might be found even in deep cold. The teepees are arranged in a circle, each one carefully positioned with the door facing east to greet the sunrise, to let the first light in even on the darkest days. These teepees are not the romantic images from paintings and photographs, but working shelters, pragmatic and beautifully efficient. The structure is simple, poles arranged in a cone, covered with buffalo hides sewn together, the bottom edge weighted with stones to keep wind from getting underneath. But the simplicity is deceptive because building and maintaining a good teepee requires tremendous knowledge. The poles must be cut from specific trees, trimmed to precise lengths and thickness. The hides must be properly tanned. Too stiff, and they'll crack in cold. Too soft, and they won't hold their shape. The way the hides are sewn matters, the type of sinew used, the size and spacing of the stitches. A well-made teepee, properly maintained, could withstand winds that would tear apart a settler's soddy, could keep a family warm in temperatures far below zero, could be taken down and moved in less than an hour when the need arose. Inside the teepee in winter, the ground is covered with layers of buffalo robes and dried grass, creating insulation from the frozen earth below. A fire burns in a pit at the center, the smoke rising through the opening at the top where the poles converge. This opening can be adjusted by moving two flaps that extend above the teepee like ears, using poles to shift them according to wind direction, creating a draft that pulls smoke up and out while keeping cold air from descending. It's a chimney that works without being a permanent structure, elegant in its simplicity and effectiveness. The fire itself is small, not the roaring blaze you might imagine, but a carefully tended low flame that produces maximum heat with minimum fuel. Wood on the plains was scarce even before settlers arrived, and winter made gathering it difficult. So fuel was precious, used sparingly, the fire kept alive overnight as embers that could be coaxed back to flame in the morning. The people who lived in this way understood cold in ways settlers never quite did, understood it not as an enemy to be fought, but as a condition to be accommodated, worked with, survived through knowledge rather than resistance. They didn't try to make their shelters as warm as summer, that would have required impossible amounts of fuel, but made them warm enough, made themselves comfortable with less warmth, made their clothing so efficient that they could move and work in temperatures that would kill an unprepared person within an hour. Their winter clothing was itself a form of knowledge made physical. Buffalo robes worn with the fur inside, the hide side out, creating dead air space between fur and skin that held body heat. Leggings of hide, sometimes lined with rabbit fur, tied tight to prevent snow from entering. Moccasins with thick buffalo hide soles and tops that extended above the ankle, stuffed with dried grass that could be changed out when it became damp from sweat. Mittens rather than gloves, because keeping fingers together preserved warmth, and the mittens themselves were made from the fur of winter animals, beaver, wolf, buffalo, creatures whose own adaptations to cold could be borrowed by humans clever enough to take and use their hides. But clothing and shelter, however well designed, couldn't solve the fundamental problem of winter. Food became scarce, and finding it required going out into the cold, expending energy that then had to be replaced by whatever food you managed to find or had stored away. The traditional plains winter diet was high in fat and protein because that's what bodies needed to generate heat. Pemmican, dried buffalo meat pounded together with fat and sometimes berries, was a winter staple, dense with calories, keeping for months, light enough to carry if the camp needed to move. Jerky, smoked meat, dried berries, roots gathered in autumn and stored carefully. These were the foods that carried people through winter, supplemented when possible by fresh game. Deer, rabbits, sometimes buffalo if a hunt was successful, though hunting buffalo in deep winter was dangerous and difficult, requiring coordination and skill and sometimes luck. Starvation was a real possibility in harsh winters, especially if the autumn hunt had been poor or if the winter lasted longer than expected. The winter counts record these times, winters marked by images that represent hunger, suffering, death from starvation. The people developed strategies for surviving lean times, rationing carefully, making sure children and elders ate first, sometimes making the decision to move camp in search of better hunting, even though moving in winter was risky. Sometimes the strategy was simply endurance, eating as little as possible, sleeping more to conserve energy, waiting for weather to break or for spring to arrive. There's a kind of knowledge about winter that can't be written down, that exists in the body and in practice. How to read the sky for coming weather, what the behavior of animals tells you about temperature and wind, how to navigate in whiteout conditions using the direction of wind and the pattern of snowdrifts. This knowledge was taught to children from the time they could understand, not through formal lessons but through observation and experience. You learned to read weather by watching the elders check the sky every morning, by hearing them discuss what they saw, by eventually being asked, "What do you see? What do you think will happen?" You learned to navigate by being taken out in progressively more difficult conditions, always with someone who knew the way, until you developed your own sense of direction, your own ability to find your way, even when landmarks disappeared under snow. You learned by doing, by making mistakes while someone was there to correct them, by gradually taking on more responsibility until one day you realized you possessed knowledge that could keep you alive. The stories told around winter fires were also a form of knowledge transfer, though they seemed like entertainment. Stories about people who got lost in storms and found their way home, stories about winters so cold that the Missouri River froze solid enough to walk across, stories about people who survived through cleverness or were killed by foolishness. All of these carried lessons embedded in narrative. A story about someone who ignored signs of coming weather and died in a storm was both a memorial and a warning. A story about someone who read the behavior of birds and sought shelter just in time was a lesson in observation. The stories didn't end with explicit morals, and this is why you must always watch the sky, because the lessons were obvious to anyone listening, woven into the tale itself. Some winters were marked by phenomena that seemed to transcend normal experience, events that entered the winter counts and stayed in memory because they were strange, inexplicable, outside the usual pattern of winter hardships. One such winter appears in several counts, a winter when lights danced across the sky night after night, colored curtains of green and red and purple that rippled like water, like fire, like nothing anyone had seen before. We know now these were displays of the aurora borealis, more common in northern latitudes but visible on the plains during periods of intense solar activity. But to people who had never seen them, who had no framework for understanding electromagnetic interactions between solar wind and Earth's atmosphere, the lights must have seemed like messages or portents, like the sky itself was trying to communicate something important and incomprehensible. The winter counts marked this winter with images of sky figures, of light patterns, different keepers choosing different ways to represent something that perhaps couldn't be adequately represented at all. What did it mean to watch night after night as the sky performed in colors that had no earthly source? How did it feel to stand in cold so intense your breath froze before reaching the ground, while above you impossible lights danced? Some winters brought sounds as strange as sights, the ice on rivers booming and cracking with reports like gunshots or thunder, the sound echoing for miles across the frozen landscape. These sounds marked the expansion and contraction of ice as temperatures swung wildly, but to hear them without understanding their cause was to hear the earth itself groaning, troubled, angry perhaps. The winter counts sometimes mark these strange winters, these times when the natural world seemed to be speaking in languages no one quite understood. They become part of the historical record not because they changed anything. The aurora didn't prevent starvation or make the cold less bitter, but because they were memorable, because they marked that winter as different from all the others. There are gaps in the winter counts, periods where the record stops or becomes unclear. Sometimes this happened because the keeper died and no one immediately took up the role, or because the hide itself was lost or destroyed. Sometimes it happened because the community suffered so much from disease, from warfare, from winters so harsh they scattered the people that maintaining the count became impossible or irrelevant. These gaps are themselves a kind of record, a testimony to disruption and loss, to winters or events so devastating they broke the continuity of memory. Archaeologists and anthropologists who study the winter counts try to match them with known historical events, to use European records to date the pictographic calendars and vice versa. Sometimes it works. An event recorded both in a winter count and in a trader's journal or military report can anchor the dating, can let you trace backward and forward with some confidence. But often there's ambiguity, multiple possible interpretations, disagreement among scholars about what a particular image represents or when exactly it occurred. The winter counts were never meant to be decoded by outsiders. They were memory aids for people who already knew the stories, who could look at a simple image and recall complex narratives that had been told and retold around winter fires. Without the oral tradition that accompanied them, the winter counts become partial, fragmentary, like finding pages of a book with no knowledge of what came before or after. We can see that something was important enough to record, but the full meaning, the emotional weight, the lessons that were drawn, these remain just beyond reach. Still, even incomplete, the winter counts offer something valuable, a different perspective on time and history, a way of marking years not by political events or the reigns of leaders, but by what happened to ordinary people, what they experienced, what they remembered. A winter of deep snow mattered more to daily life than a distant battle. A year when the buffalo were plentiful was worth recording even if nothing else of note occurred. This way of thinking about history as a lived experience rather than a series of great events changes how you understand the past. It makes you think about what daily life was like, about the small details that don't usually make it into history books, the cold that never quite left your bones, the hunger that was always present in late winter, the relief when spring finally arrived and you knew you'd survived another year. Some winter counts include images that modern scholars can't definitively interpret, symbols whose meanings have been lost as the keepers died and the oral traditions were disrupted by the enormous changes that swept across the plains in the 19th century. These mysterious images are tantalizing. Are they marking spiritual events, unusual natural phenomena, personal experiences of the keeper, or something else entirely? One winter count includes an image of a figure that seems to be floating or flying, surrounded by what might be stars or might be snow. Some scholars interpret this as marking a winter when someone died, and their passing was particularly significant. Others suggest it might represent a vision or spiritual experience, or possibly the aurora again, rendered in a different style. The truth is, we don't know, and perhaps we can never know without the oral tradition that would explain it. The image remains enigmatic and beautiful, a reminder that history always contains more than we can recover, that the past is both accessible and forever beyond our full comprehension. The teepees themselves, when abandoned, left little trace. Unlike sod houses or log cabins which crumbled but remained visible for decades, a teepee site would show almost nothing after a few years, perhaps a circle of stones that weighted the hide covering, perhaps charcoal from the central fire pit, perhaps nothing at all if the camp had been in place only briefly. Archaeologists searching for evidence of traditional plains life before extensive European settlement have to work with subtle clues, patterns in soil composition, scatters of broken tools or pottery, concentrations of animal bones from butchering sites. The ephemeral nature of the traditional lifestyle means much of it has vanished, leaving only traces that require expert eyes to identify and interpret. But occasionally something more substantial remains. In river-cut banks or eroding hillsides, sometimes a cache is revealed, a pit where items were buried for safekeeping and then never retrieved. These caches might contain tools, clothing, sometimes even food, preserved by the cold and dry conditions. One such cache, found in the 1970s in South Dakota, contained several pairs of winter moccasins, still in remarkable condition after perhaps 100 years underground. The moccasins showed the sophistication of their construction, multiple layers, careful stitching, the grass insulation still present inside, the whole assemblage a testimony to the skill and knowledge required to create footwear that could keep you alive through a Dakota winter. Looking at these moccasins in a museum case, you can almost feel the cold they were designed to resist, can imagine the hands that made them, probably a woman's hands, working by firelight through a winter evening, using knowledge passed down through generations, creating something both functional and beautiful. The beadwork on the top of the moccasins, small geometric patterns in red and blue and white, served no practical purpose, but added something important nonetheless. A reminder that survival required more than mere function, that beauty and pride mattered even in the face of cold that could kill. Other caches have revealed less romantic but equally important items: stone tools for scraping hides, awls for punching holes in leather, bone needles for sewing, the basic equipment needed to create clothing and shelter. These objects, mundane in themselves, represent thousands of hours of knowledge, knowing which stone makes the best scraper, how to shape and sharpen it, the angle and pressure needed to scrape a hide clean without damaging it. Every object created by traditional methods required knowledge, and every piece of knowledge represented generations of trial and error, of learning what worked and what didn't, of passing successful techniques down through teaching and demonstration. A bone needle seems simple until you try to make one, until you realize you need to know which bones to use, how to shape them without breaking, how to drill a hole for thread in material as hard as stone. The buffalo themselves, before they were nearly exterminated, held a kind of knowledge in their behavior. They moved with the seasons, migrating north in summer and south in winter, but within that overall pattern, they responded to local conditions in ways that people observed and learned from. If buffalo moved out of an area earlier than usual in autumn, it might mean a harsh winter was coming. If they gathered in certain valleys, it suggested those places offered better shelter or forage. Hunters who paid attention to buffalo behavior learned to predict weather and to find the best places to winter, borrowing the buffalo's instinctive knowledge of the land. When the buffalo herds were destroyed, killed by the millions for their hides for sport, as a deliberate strategy to undermine the traditional plains lifestyle, this source of knowledge disappeared with them. The people lost not just their primary source of food and materials, but also the living library of behavior that had helped guide their own movements and decisions. The few buffalo that survived did so in protected places, in herds that were deliberately preserved, and their behavior changed. Confined to smaller ranges, no longer migrating vast distances fed by humans when necessary, they became different creatures, no longer exhibiting the full range of natural behaviors that had once provided information and guidance. It's a particular kind of loss, the loss of knowledge held not in human memory, but in the behavior of animals, in the patterns of their movement across landscape. When the last truly wild buffalo disappeared, they took with them understanding that can't be reconstructed from written records or archaeological evidence, because it was never written or made into objects. It existed only in observation, in the relationship between people and animals who shared the land. The winter counts continued into the early 20th century, though their nature changed as the people's lives changed. Later counts marked the transition to reservation life, the loss of traditional ways, winters spent in government-issued housing rather than teepees, food received as rations rather than hunted. These later winters are marked with images that show the tension between old and new. A teepee next to a square house, traditional clothing alongside Western dress, the mixture and conflict of ways of being. The counts become records of cultural change, of adaptation and loss, of people trying to maintain identity and memory while living in circumstances that demanded transformation. Some keepers stopped maintaining their counts, deciding that the new life didn't fit the old pattern of marking memorable events, or perhaps feeling that the events now were too painful, too much a record of loss to be worth preserving. Other keepers continued, finding ways to record even the difficult changes, maintaining the tradition even as the world it documented disappeared. The last traditional winter count is thought to have been maintained until the 1920s, by which point most of the keepers had died, and the younger generation had been educated in Western schools, taught to record time and history in European ways, with dates and written narratives rather than pictographic calendars. The counts that survived were collected by anthropologists, historians, and museums, where they remain as artifacts, beautiful and enigmatic, partial windows into ways of understanding time and experience that are fundamentally different from the dominant culture that eventually overwhelmed them. You can see them now behind glass, the images faded but still visible on hide or cloth, each small pictograph representing a year, a winter, a moment of collective memory. But seeing them in museums isn't the same as seeing them in use, as watching a keeper add a new image while explaining its meaning to children who will someday maintain the count themselves. The living tradition is gone, though descendants of the keepers sometimes still know the stories, can sometimes explain what certain images mean, can restore some of the context that makes the counts more than just curious artifacts. There's something deeply poignant about these winter counts, these attempts to hold time and memory in simple images. They represent a kind of history that doesn't claim objectivity or completeness, that acknowledges from the start that what gets remembered is what seemed important to someone at the time, filtered through individual perception and collective agreement. A winter remembered for deep snow might have also seen births and deaths and love stories and conflicts, but if the snow was what stood out, that's what got recorded. The count doesn't try to capture everything, it captures enough to trigger memory, to let people recall the fuller story when they look at the image and think back. In this way, the winter counts are perhaps more honest than conventional histories, which often pretend to comprehensive objectivity while actually being just as selective, just shaped by different criteria about what matters and what doesn't. The counts admit their limitations, their subjective nature, and in doing so they remind us that all history is partial, all memory is selective, all attempts to preserve the past are necessarily incomplete. The winters themselves, the physical reality of cold and snow and survival, haven't changed as much as you might think. The Great Plains still see temperatures drop to 30 or 40 below zero, still see blizzards that shut down highways and strand travelers, still impose hardship on anyone living there. What's changed is the infrastructure of survival: heated houses, stocked grocery stores, snowplows and emergency services, weather forecasting that gives days of warning, clothing made from synthetic materials designed to trap warmth more efficiently than any natural fiber. Survival has become easier, more reliable, less dependent on personal knowledge, and more dependent on technological and social systems. But those systems can fail, and when they do, the old knowledge becomes relevant again. A power outage in winter, a vehicle breakdown in a remote area, a storm that exceeds predictions. These situations strip away the technological cushion and reveal that winter is still dangerous, still capable of killing the unprepared, still demanding respect and caution and knowledge. The descendants of both traditions, the people whose ancestors lived in teepees and the people whose ancestors built soddies, still live on the plains, still face winter each year. They carry different histories, different memories, different cultural frameworks for understanding their relationship with this landscape and its seasons. But they share the experience of cold, of wind, of snow that erases the horizon and makes the world seem small and precarious. They share the relief when spring finally arrives, the gratitude for warmth, the understanding that winter will return, that the cycle continues regardless of human wishes or plans. The winter counts, sitting in their museum cases, testify to this continuity. Winters happened before anyone recorded them, will happen after all records are forgotten. The plains will continue to freeze, the wind will continue to blow, the snow will continue to fall, indifferent to human presence, demanding accommodation from anyone who chooses to live here. Not everyone on the Dakota plains faced winter, from inside a soddy with dirt floors and thin walls. Not everyone rationed beans and cornmeal through February, wondering if supplies would last until spring. There existed, even on this remote frontier, a class of people whose experience of winter, while still difficult, was fundamentally different from that of the ordinary settler. These were the elite of the plains, military officers stationed at frontier forts, territorial officials and their families, railroad executives overseeing the expansion of lines across the prairie, wealthy ranchers who'd arrived with capital enough to build substantial operations, merchants in the small towns who prospered by supplying those who had less. Their numbers were small, their presence scattered across vast distances, but their experience of winter reveals how much difference wealth and position could make, how the same storm that killed a settler's children might be merely an inconvenience to someone with better shelter, more resources, and access to systems of support unavailable to those living in isolated homesteads. Consider Fort Abraham Lincoln, established near present-day Bismarck in the early 1870s. This was one of several military installations built to project federal authority across the northern plains, to protect railroad construction, to serve as bases for campaigns against indigenous resistance. The fort housed hundreds of soldiers along with officers and their families, laundresses, scouts, civilian employees, a complete community maintained by the resources of the United States Army. The buildings were substantial, officers' quarters made of wood with multiple rooms, enlisted men's barracks designed to house dozens with large stoves for heat, stables for cavalry horses, warehouses for supplies, a hospital, a bakery, even a bandstand for summer concerts. When winter arrived at Fort Lincoln, life certainly became harder. The temperature dropped just as severely as it did at any soddy, the wind blew just as fiercely, the snow piled just as deep. But the residents of the fort faced these conditions from behind thick wooden walls, with glazed windows that sealed against drafts, with stoves specifically designed for efficient heating, with warehouses full of firewood and coal hauled in by wagon before the snow made transportation impossible. They had blankets issued by the quartermaster, food supplied through military logistics, medical care from an army surgeon. Officers' wives, women like Libby Custer, who spent winters at frontier forts, wrote letters and kept diaries that describe winter as uncomfortable but manageable, even tedious. They complained of being confined indoors, of missing social activities, of the monotony of military routine intensified by weather that prevented travel or entertainment. But they didn't write about wondering if their children would starve, about losing toes to frostbite, about lying awake, terrified that the roof would collapse. Their concerns were of a different order entirely. How to maintain some semblance of civilized life, how to occupy time during long winter months, how to manage servants and maintain social standing in the peculiar circumstances of frontier military society. The officers' quarters at a place like Fort Lincoln were positively spacious compared to a settler's soddy. Multiple rooms allowed for separation of functions, a parlor for receiving guests, a dining room for meals, bedrooms for sleeping, even a small room that might serve as a study or office. Furniture was real furniture, not rough-hewn boards, but pieces brought from the East or ordered from catalogues, chairs with cushions, tables with tablecloths, beds with actual mattresses and bed frames. The floors were wood, not dirt, and could be covered with rugs. The walls could be decorated with pictures, the windows with curtains. The contrast with ordinary settler life was stark. While a family in a soddy huddled in a single room around a fire that struggled against the cold, an officer's family might gather in a warm parlor, the children playing on the floor, the adults reading or conversing, a lamp providing steady light that didn't have to be rationed quite so carefully. Meals were regular and relatively varied. The army purchased beef, flour, sugar, coffee, vegetables when available, and while the quality might not match what you'd find in a city restaurant, it was reliable, sufficient, predictable. Officers' families could supplement military rations by purchasing additional items from the post trader, canned goods, preserves, luxuries like tea or chocolate, and by hosting dinners where the combined resources of several households created meals that approached elegance, at least by frontier standards. Compare this to the settler family measuring out the last pounds of flour, making thin soup from salt pork and beans, sending children to bed hungry because there simply wasn't enough. The military families faced no such desperation. Their winters might be boring, might be cold despite good heating, might feel isolating, but they were never life-threatening in the way a settler's winter could be. Entertainment at the forts included activities that would have seemed like impossible luxuries to homesteaders: dances and parties, amateur theatrical productions, card games and reading circles, holiday celebrations with decorations and special meals. Christmas at Fort Lincoln might feature a decorated tree, presents exchanged among families, a feast in the officers' mess, music and dancing that lasted into the evening. Meanwhile, 3 miles away in any direction, a settler family would mark Christmas, if they marked it at all, with a slightly larger meal if they could spare it, perhaps a small gift for children made from scraps of cloth or whittled from wood, a prayer of thanks for having survived to see another Christmas and hope they'd survive to see the next. The forts were connected to the outside world in ways individual homesteads could never be. Telegraph lines, when they worked, brought news from the east, from territorial capitals, from other military installations. Mail arrived with some regularity, delayed by winter certainly, but still coming through, carried by military couriers who travelled routes that civilian mail carriers wouldn't attempt. An officer's wife could write letters to family back east and receive replies within weeks, could stay connected to a larger world, could remind herself that the fort was temporary, that she'd eventually return to civilization. Settlers, by contrast, might go entire winters without any communication with the world beyond their immediate neighbors. Letters sent in November might not arrive until April, and responses wouldn't come until summer. The isolation was complete, absolute, unbroken by any thread of connection to distant places or people. The forts also had medical care that, while primitive by modern standards, was vastly superior to what settlers could access. Army surgeons treated frostbite, pneumonia, fevers, injuries, not always successfully, but with actual medical training, with instruments and medicines, with at least some knowledge of disease and treatment. A child at a fort who developed pneumonia had a chance of receiving care that might save them: a warm hospital room, attention from someone with medical knowledge, access to whatever medicines were available. A settler's child with the same illness received home remedies and prayers, and more often than not died. This disparity in medical care alone meant that winter mortality was strikingly different between military families and settler families. While settlers lost children and spouses to conditions that might have been survivable with proper care, military families, though not immune to disease and death, had significantly better outcomes. Beyond the military forts, other forms of elite life existed on the plains. The railroad companies, pushing their lines westward through Dakota Territory in the 1870s and 1880s, maintained stations and division points where officials and higher-level employees lived in relative comfort. These railroad towns, places like Fargo or Grand Forks, had substantial buildings, hotels that catered to travelers and railroad personnel, warehouses full of goods transported by rail, access to resources that isolated homesteads lacked. The railroad superintendent in such a town might live in a large house, heated by multiple stoves or even a furnace, with gas lighting if the town had a gas works, with hired help to manage household tasks. His winter involved continuing work, managing train schedules, overseeing maintenance of lines and equipment, coordinating the movement of goods and passengers. But he did this work from heated offices, travelled in heated rail cars when necessary, and returned each evening to a comfortable home where his family waited with a warm meal. The contrast with a settler who might see a train pass in the distance, a glimpse of movement and power heading elsewhere, but had no access to its resources, no ability to benefit from its presence, except perhaps to sell grain in autumn at a price determined by railroad rates, was profound. The railroad connected some people to comfort and prosperity, while leaving others stranded in isolation and hardship. Wealthy ranchers represented another form of elite life on the plains. These were men who'd arrived with capital, who purchased or claimed large tracts of land, who built operations around herds numbered in hundreds or thousands of cattle. Their ranch houses were often substantial structures, built of milled lumber rather than sod, with multiple rooms, real windows, solid construction that resisted wind and cold far better than a homesteader's shack. They employed ranch hands, cowboys who lived in bunkhouses, who tended the cattle through winter, who took on the dangerous work of riding through storms to check on herds. The rancher himself might ride out occasionally, might supervise and manage, but he wasn't exposed to the constant grinding hardship of doing all the work himself. He had help, had employees who took on the most dangerous and difficult tasks, and he could retreat to his relatively comfortable house when conditions became too severe. His family, wife and children, lived in circumstances that approximated middle-class life back east. They had sufficient food, warm clothing, education for the children provided either by hired tutors or by sending them to schools in distant towns, access to goods ordered from catalogs or purchased on trips to railroad towns. Winter was still isolating, still limited their activities, but it didn't threaten their survival. They knew they had enough food to last, enough fuel to stay warm, enough resources to weather any storm. This certainty, this security, was itself a luxury that most settlers couldn't afford. The ranchers and their families might even find winter somewhat pleasant in its own way, a break from the busy work of other seasons, time to read, to pursue hobbies, to simply rest. The winter that exhausted a homesteader to the point of numbness might offer a wealthy rancher a chance for leisure, for reflection, for pursuits that had nothing to do with mere survival. Territorial officials, governors, judges, legislators, experienced winter from the relative comfort of territorial capitals like Yankton or Bismarck. These small but growing towns offered amenities unavailable in rural areas: hotels with dining rooms, stores with varied goods, social opportunities, heated public buildings. A territorial judge might hear cases in a courtroom warmed by a large stove, might live in a hotel where staff maintained fires and prepared meals, might spend evenings in conversation with other officials and prominent citizens, discussing politics and business over whiskey and cigars. His winter was busy with work, but comfortable, protected from the worst that weather could offer. His wife, if she accompanied him, would participate in the limited but real social life of the territorial capital: teas and gatherings, church services, charitable activities. She'd wear dresses that were fashionable, or at least attempting to be, would maintain standards of appearance and behavior that connected her to a broader culture beyond the frontier. Meanwhile, settler women wore the same patched dress day after day because it was the only one they owned that was warm enough, washed their hair perhaps once a month because heating water for bathing consumed too much fuel, and had no social life beyond occasionally seeing a neighbor when weather permitted. The merchants in small plains towns occupied an intermediate position between the true elite and ordinary settlers. A successful merchant, someone who ran a general store or a grain elevator, had steady income, a building that provided both business space and living quarters, access to goods that others had to purchase from him. His winter meant keeping the store open when weather allowed, selling supplies to settlers who came to town, extending credit that might or might not be repaid, gradually accumulating wealth while those he served struggled to survive. He was better off than his customers, but not as insulated as military officers or wealthy ranchers, existing in that middle space where comfort was real but not excessive, where security was present but not absolute. The children of these various elite groups, officers' children, merchants' children, ranchers' children, experienced winter differently from settler children. They had schooling, often from educated teachers, rather than whoever could be convinced to take the job. They had toys and books, real toys ordered from catalogs, books that expanded their world beyond the immediate and visible. They had warm clothing that fit, shoes that didn't leak, coats that were actually adequate for the cold. Most importantly, they had a sense of security that settler children lacked. They didn't go to bed hungry, didn't worry that their parents couldn't provide, didn't carry the anxiety that permeated homestead life. This psychological difference, this freedom from constant fear and want, shaped them in ways that would affect their entire lives, giving them confidence and optimism that children raised in desperation rarely developed. Yet for all these advantages, for all the ways wealth and position cushioned against winter's worst effects, no one on the plains was completely immune to danger. Blizzards killed without regard to social class, and those who ventured out into storms, even wealthy ranchers on their well-bred horses, even military officers carrying dispatches, could die just as easily as poor settlers. The Children's Blizzard of 1888 took some victims from privileged backgrounds alongside the settler children who made up most of its death toll. A storm didn't care if you wore expensive clothes or rode a fine horse. If you were caught outside when it struck, your chances depended on luck and knowledge, not wealth. This vulnerability created a kind of equality in winter, a reminder that nature imposed limits on human hierarchies. A wealthy rancher who got lost between his barn and house could freeze to death within yards of shelter, just like a poor homesteader. A military force could run low on supplies if storms prevented resupply for too long. A railroad town could be cut off, isolated, its connections to the outside world severed by snow until the weather broke. These moments of shared vulnerability, rare but real, complicated the otherwise stark divisions between rich and poor on the plains. Everyone understood that winter demanded respect, that it could kill anyone who made mistakes or was simply unlucky, regardless of how much money they had or what their social position might be. Still, the overall pattern was clear. Wealth brought safety, comfort, security, and survival. The gap between a military officer's family celebrating Christmas with a tree and gifts and feast, and a settler family huddled in a dark soddy hoping the flour would last another month, was a gap measured not just in resources but in fundamental quality of life, in hope and despair, in the difference between viewing winter as an inconvenience and experiencing it as a daily threat to existence. The elite on the plains understood this gap, understood that their comfort depended partly on the labor of those who had less. Ranch hands worked for wages that barely supported them, living in crude bunkhouses, taking risks that the rancher didn't have to take. Soldiers enlisted because they had few other options, endured military discipline and frontier hardship for pay that was minimal, while officers lived in relative comfort and commanded from positions of safety. Settlers bought supplies from merchants at prices that enriched the merchants while keeping the settlers perpetually in debt. This economic structure was neither unique to the plains nor particularly remarkable by 19th century standards. It was simply how society organized itself, how wealth concentrated among a few while the many struggled. But winter made the disparities more visible, more consequential, because winter was when resources mattered most, when having enough or not enough became a matter of life and death. Some among the elite recognized this and felt some degree of responsibility or guilt. Officers' wives might organize charity drives, collecting clothes or food to distribute to struggling settler families. Merchants might extend credit more generously than business sense suggested, knowing that refusing credit could mean a family starved. Ranchers might hire additional hands in winter, providing employment and shelter when jobs were otherwise impossible to find. These gestures of charity or kindness made some difference at the margins, helped some families survive who might not have otherwise, but they didn't fundamentally change the structure of inequality. The elite remained elite, the poor remained poor, and winter continued to treat them differently based on circumstances that had everything to do with human, social organization and nothing to do with individual merit or virtue. The churches in small towns tried to bridge these gaps, preaching messages of common humanity, of charity and brotherhood, of rich and poor being equal before God. Sunday services brought together, at least theoretically, people from different classes: the merchant and his customers, the rancher and his hands, the officer and the enlisted man. But even in church, divisions persisted. The wealthy sat in front pews, wore better clothes, contributed more to the collection, and had more influence over church decisions. The poor sat in back if they came at all. Many settlers lived too far from town to attend regularly, and when they did come, they were acutely aware of their shabby appearance, their worn clothes, their obvious poverty. Holiday celebrations revealed the divisions most clearly. Christmas in a territorial capital or at a military fort meant decorations, music, gifts, special meals, a sense of abundance and generosity. Christmas on an isolated homestead meant doing without, making do, trying to create some sense of celebration from nothing, and often failing, the day passing like any other, except for a prayer of thanks for survival and a hope for better times ahead. New Year brought similar contrasts. The elite celebrated with parties and toasts, looking forward to the year ahead with optimism based on their secure positions. Settlers marked the new year, if they marked it at all, with grim determination to survive another winter, another season, another year of hardship that might, if they were lucky and worked without rest, eventually result in some small prosperity. The territorial newspapers published in towns and read primarily by the elite and middle class sometimes reported on frontier hardships, on storms and deaths and struggles. But these reports had a quality of distance, of observation rather than experience. A story about a family found frozen in their cabin became a cautionary tale for readers who would never face such conditions, a reminder to be grateful for their own circumstances, perhaps a prompt for charitable donations to help the less fortunate. The actual experience of that family, the desperation, the fear, the suffering, was reduced to a few paragraphs in the back pages, interesting but not urgent, tragic but remote. As winter progressed from December through January and February into March, the strain accumulated differently for different classes. For the elite, winter became tedious, boring, something to be endured until spring brought renewed activity and opportunity. For settlers, winter became desperate, each day harder than the last, supplies dwindling, exhaustion accumulating, the question shifting from will we be comfortable to will we survive at all. By late February, homesteaders were often at the breaking point, out of flour, out of fuel, out of energy, simply waiting for spring to arrive before it was too late. The elite, by contrast, still had resources in reserve. Their warehouses and storerooms still held supplies, their fuel piles were still adequate, their larders were still stocked. They could afford to feel confident that they'd make it through, that spring would arrive before their resources ran out. This confidence itself was a form of wealth, a psychological resource that the poor lacked. Knowing you'll survive allowed you to think about other things, to plan for the future, to maintain hope and optimism. Not knowing whether you'll make it through the next month made everything else irrelevant, narrowed your focus to the immediate and desperate present. When spring finally came, the snow melting, the ground thawing, the wind losing its bitter edge, the elite resumed their lives with minimal disruption. They'd been uncomfortable, perhaps confined and bored, but they emerged from winter fundamentally unchanged, ready to continue their work and their comfortable lives. Settlers emerged from winter damaged, physically weakened by months of poor nutrition, psychologically scarred by months of fear and desperation, financially devastated by the costs of survival. They faced spring not with relief and optimism, but with exhaustion and the daunting realization that they had to begin again, to work another season, to face another winter, eventually, the cycle continuing without clear end. The elite could look at winter as something they'd conquered, as proof of their superiority, their ability to thrive even in difficult conditions. They'd maintained civilization in the wilderness, had kept up appearances and standards, had demonstrated that proper resources and organization could overcome any challenge. But this interpretation conveniently ignored that their success depended on those resources, on infrastructure and supply chains and economic systems that ordinary settlers simply didn't have access to. It wasn't superior character or virtue that kept them comfortable. It was money, position, power. The settlers understood this, even if they rarely articulated it. They saw the contrast, knew that their suffering was preventable, that they endured hardship, not because it was necessary, but because that's how society was organized, how resources were distributed, how power operated. This knowledge created resentment, sometimes bitterness, a sense that the system was rigged against them. But mostly it just created weariness, a resigned acceptance that this was how things were, that complaining changed nothing, that their only option was to keep going, to keep trying, to hope that eventually their work would pay off and they'd achieve some small measure of security. In the meantime, winter returned every year, and every year the same divisions played out, the comfortable and the desperate, the protected and the exposed, those who viewed winter as an inconvenience and those who experienced it as a fight for survival. The snows fell on everyone equally, but beyond that there was nothing equal about winter on the Dakota plains. The land itself didn't recognize these human divisions. The wind blew across sod houses and wooden mansions with equal force. The cold seeped into both without regard to who owned them. The storms buried poor and rich alike under the same white blanket. But the outcomes were different. Survival rates were different. The quality of experience was different, all shaped by human systems of wealth and power that preceded winter and would outlast it. The elite would eventually leave the frontier, return east when their tours of duty ended, when their railroad work was complete, when they'd made their fortunes. The settlers, if they survived, would stay, would prove up their claims or lose them, would eventually see the plains transform from frontier to settled territory to states, would become the foundation population of a new society. Their suffering in those early winters would be forgotten or romanticized, turned into tales of pioneer courage rather than indictments of economic inequality. But for now, in the depths of winter in the 1870s and 1880s, the divisions were stark and undeniable, the gap between comfort and desperation as wide as the prairie itself, as cold as the wind that swept across it, as persistent as the snow that returned each year to test who would survive and who would not. We've traveled now through many winters, through different experiences of the same cold, the same wind, the same snow that fell on Dakota territory in those years when the land was still being claimed, still being shaped by the people who chose or were forced to live there. We've stood in sod houses and felt the cold seep through 3-foot walls. We've watched children walk to school on a morning that turned lethal within minutes. We've examined painted hides that recorded winters in simple symbols, and we've glimpsed the warmer rooms where those with wealth and position waited out the season in relative comfort. All of these experiences, different as they were, shared the common fact of winter, the inescapable reality that for several months each year, the northern plains became a place where survival required constant attention, where small mistakes could have fatal consequences, where the line between life and death was as thin as the ice on a water bucket. Winter shaped everyone who lived through it, changed them in ways both obvious and subtle, left marks that persisted long after the snow melted and the prairie turned green again. The settlers who survived those early winters, who managed to prove up their claims and establish farms that would last, carried the memory of hardship for the rest of their lives. They never quite forgot what it felt like to be cold all the time, to be hungry, to lie awake wondering if the roof would hold, or if this would be the storm that finally overwhelmed them. Even decades later, when they lived in better houses with proper heating, when food was reliable and clothing was adequate, they remembered. They remembered so vividly that they couldn't waste anything, couldn't throw away food or fuel or fabric that might be mended, couldn't relax into comfort without some part of their mind whispering that it might all disappear, that winter might come again in its full fury and take everything away. Their children, born into slightly better circumstances, heard the stories but couldn't fully understand them, couldn't quite grasp what their parents had endured, because by the time those children were old enough to remember, conditions had improved. More settlers meant more neighbors, which meant less isolation. Better construction techniques and more resources meant warmer houses. Railroads brought supplies more reliably, stores stocked more goods, towns grew and offered services that hadn't existed in the earliest years. Winter was still hard, still dangerous, but it wasn't quite the same existential threat it had been in the beginning. The children knew cold and wind and snow, but they didn't know the particular quality of desperation their parents had experienced, that bone-deep fear that came from being utterly alone with insufficient resources against a season that could kill without warning. The grandchildren knew even less. By the time they came along, usually in the early 1900s, the frontier period was ending. The plains were settled, divided into counties and townships, crisscrossed by roads and rail lines, dotted with towns that had schools and churches and newspapers. Winter was still winter, still cold, still bringing blizzards occasionally, but the infrastructure of survival had been built. You could call for help, you could get supplies, you could rely on systems rather than solely on your own resources and knowledge. These grandchildren heard stories about the old days, about sod houses and the children's blizzard, and winters so cold the cattle froze, standing up. But these stories became increasingly distant, increasingly like myths from a vanished world. The grandchildren lived in a different reality, one where winter was manageable, where you could be reasonably confident that you'd survive it without dramatic suffering or loss. This transformation happened quickly, within 2 or 3 generations. The brutal frontier winter of the 1870s and 1880s became the merely difficult rural winter of the 1920s and 1930s, which became the uncomfortable but manageable small-town winter of the 1950s and beyond. Each generation built on what the previous generation had learned and established. Each inherited better infrastructure and more knowledge. Each faced winter with more resources and less fear. The progression wasn't smooth. The Dust Bowl and Depression years brought their own hardships, proved that survival was never completely assured, but the overall trend was toward greater security, toward winter becoming something to endure rather than something that might kill you. The indigenous peoples who had lived on the plains for centuries before settlers arrived faced their own transformations during this period. The destruction of the buffalo herds, the confinement to reservations, the forced abandonment of traditional ways of life, all of this happened roughly simultaneously with the settler experience we've been exploring, creating a complex layering of different peoples, different experiences, different relationships with the land and its seasons. The Lakota and Dakota and Nakota peoples had their own knowledge about surviving plains winters, knowledge developed over generations, encoded in practice and story, and the winter counts we examined earlier. But that knowledge became increasingly irrelevant as the conditions of their lives changed, as they were forced into sedentary reservation life, as the buffalo disappeared, and the government provided rations instead. Their winters after confinement were different from their winters before, shaped by poverty and loss and the trauma of cultural destruction. They faced the same cold as always, but now from within a system designed to erase their way of life, to force assimilation, to make them into something they'd never been. The comparison between their experience and the settler experience reveals something important about winter and survival. It's not just about physical conditions, temperature and wind and snow, but about having the knowledge, resources, and autonomy to respond effectively to those conditions. Both indigenous peoples and poor settlers faced serious hardship, but their hardships were shaped by larger forces of colonization, economic inequality, and power that determined who had access to what resources, who received support, and who was left to struggle alone. The elite of the frontier period, the military officers, the railroad executives, the wealthy ranchers, mostly moved on when their time on the plains ended. They returned east or moved to cities, taking their memories of frontier winters with them, but leaving behind the actual experience of that life. Some wrote memoirs that described their time on the frontier, often with a tone of adventure and accomplishment, framing their experience as testing and exciting rather than terrifying and desperate. These memoirs became part of how the frontier period was remembered, influencing the broader culture's understanding of what that time was like. But their perspective was limited, filtered through privilege, unable to fully capture what the majority of people on the plains experienced. Their winters were real, their discomfort was genuine, but their accounts missing the essential element of fear, of true desperation that defined winter for those with fewer resources. The landscape itself still bears marks of this history, though you have to know what to look for. Scattered across the Dakotas and Nebraska and Montana, you can find remnants of old homesteads, depressions in the ground where sod houses once stood, stone foundations of structures long since collapsed, rusty farm equipment slowly being reclaimed by prairie grass. These traces are subtle, easily overlooked, but they're there for those who search, evidence of the thousands of families who came west, who built lives on empty grassland, who endured winters that tested them to their limits. Some of those families succeeded, proved up their claims, established farms that their descendants still work today. Others failed, gave up after one winter or several, left the plains and returned to wherever they'd come from, or moved further west, or simply disappeared from historical record, leaving only a depression in the ground and a notation in a land office ledger to prove they were ever there at all. The towns that grew during the frontier period followed various paths. Some thrived, became county seats or regional centers, grew into small cities with all the amenities of modern life. Others declined as railroads shifted routes or agriculture consolidated, became ghost towns with empty buildings and streets where wind blows unimpeded, monuments to ambitions that didn't pan out, to communities that couldn't sustain themselves once the initial settlement period passed. A few of these ghost towns still show signs of their winter struggles, buildings oriented to shelter from north wind, thick walls designed to hold heat, cellars dug deep for storage and protection. The forts that provided shelter and comfort to military families were mostly decommissioned by the early 1900s, their garrisons withdrawn once the Indian Wars ended, and the frontier was declared closed. Some became state parks or historic sites, their buildings preserved or reconstructed to show visitors what frontier military life was like. Walking through Fort Abraham Lincoln today, you can tour the officers' quarters and imagine the winters described earlier, the relative comfort, the social life, the protection from the worst of the weather. But you're walking through in summer likely, or on a mild day, and even with imagination you can't fully feel what winter meant in that time and place. The winter counts, those pictographic calendars that recorded indigenous memory, mostly reside now in museums and archives, studied by scholars, occasionally displayed for public viewing. Some tribes have worked to reclaim and interpret their winter counts, to restore the oral traditions that gave the images full meaning, to teach younger generations about this way of recording history. But the tradition itself, the practice of a keeper adding a new image each year while explaining its meaning to the community, has largely ended. The counts remain as artifacts, beautiful and enigmatic, bridges to a way of thinking about time and memory that differs from the dominant culture's approach, reminders that there are multiple ways to understand and record human experience. Modern life on the northern plains still involves winter, still requires residents to prepare for cold and snow and wind that can be dangerous even with all the advantages of contemporary technology. The blizzard of 1888 has been followed by other severe winters, other storms that killed people and livestock, other demonstrations that nature hasn't been fully tamed despite our best efforts. But the experience is fundamentally different now. Weather forecasting gives days of warning for most storms, allowing preparation and reducing surprise. Transportation systems, highways, snowplows, emergency services mean that isolation is rare and temporary. Communication technologies, phones, internet, radio, keep people connected even when travel is impossible. Heating systems and insulated buildings, reliable electricity and gas service mean that staying warm is mostly a matter of paying utility bills rather than hauling fuel and tending fires. These changes represent real progress, genuine improvements in human welfare that shouldn't be dismissed or romanticized away. Living through a Dakota winter in the 1880s was objectively harder, more dangerous, more likely to result in death or suffering than living through the same winter in the 2020s. The people who endured those early winters weren't heroes in any simple sense. They were just people who didn't have better options, who did what they had to do to survive, who sometimes succeeded and sometimes failed, depending on factors often beyond their control. We don't honor their memory by pretending their suffering was noble or character-building, but rather by acknowledging honestly what they endured and recognizing how far we've come in making winter survivable, even manageable, for people living in one of the harshest climates on the continent. At the same time, something was perhaps lost in this transition to easier winters, to survival that doesn't require constant vigilance and effort. The settlers and the indigenous peoples who faced winter with minimal resources developed kinds of knowledge and resilience that aren't necessary anymore, skills that have atrophied as they've become obsolete. Most people today couldn't survive even a few days in the conditions that those earlier generations lived through for months, not because we're weaker or less capable, but because we've never had to learn those skills, never developed that particular kind of toughness. We've traded that knowledge for comfort and security, and it's probably a good trade, but it's worth acknowledging what was traded away. The stories of those winters, the settler stories, the indigenous stories, the stories of storms and survival and loss remain important even as the immediate experience they describe recedes further into the past. They remind us that comfort and security are recent developments, that most of human history involved facing conditions that would seem intolerable to modern sensibilities, that our ancestors, whether biological or cultural, endured things we can barely imagine. They also remind us that those conditions weren't inevitable, weren't necessary, could have been ameliorated by better social organization, by different distributions of resources, by systems that prioritized human welfare over profit or expansion. The settlers who suffered in sod houses while military officers lived comfortably in wooden quarters weren't suffering because suffering was unavoidable, but because society had organized itself in ways that concentrated resources among the few and left the many to struggle. These lessons have contemporary relevance, though we won't belabor them here. Suffice it to say that winter on the plains teaches not just about physical survival, but about how societies function, how inequality operates, how systems determine who flourishes and who barely survives. As you lie there now in whatever comfortable space you occupy, warmed by systems you don't have to tend, fed by food you didn't have to hunt or grow or ration carefully, connected to a world beyond your immediate surroundings by technologies that would seem like magic to someone from the 1880s, you might feel a moment of gratitude for these circumstances, for living in a time and place where winter is inconvenient rather than deadly. You might also spare a thought for those who came before, who lived through winters we've spent this evening exploring, who endured and sometimes failed to endure, who left traces in the land and in memory that tell us something about human capacity for both suffering and resilience. Their winters are over now, long over, the cold that gripped them released a century ago or more. They've returned to Earth, buried in cemeteries scattered across the plains, their names on weathered stones or forgotten entirely, their individual stories mostly lost, but their collective experience preserved in fragments, in documents and artifacts, and the landscape itself. The snow that buried them has melted and returned and melted again countless times. The wind that chilled them has blown itself out into silence. The seasons have continued their cycle without pause or memory. But we remember, after a fashion, we tell their stories, we study their artifacts, we try to understand what they experienced and what it meant. We do this partly out of historical interest, partly to honor those who struggled, partly to better understand ourselves and the societies we've inherited from those harder times. And as you drift towards sleep now, as consciousness releases its grip and your mind softens into dreams or darkness, you can let go of these stories, let them settle like snow into memory, gentle and quiet, covering the landscape of your thoughts with a soft white blanket that muffles sound and obscures detail. The winters we've explored together are long past, their dangers resolved into history, their cold unable to reach you here in your warmth and safety. Let the images fade, the sod house, the one-room schoolhouse, the figure struggling through white chaos, the pictographs on hide, the comfortable parlor in the officers' quarters. Let them all blur and dissolve like snow melting in spring, like the thaw that eventually came to all those frozen winters we've visited tonight. The Great Plains are still there, still facing winter each year, still enduring cold and wind and snow under the same wide sky that covered the settlers and the indigenous peoples and all who lived and died on that vast grassland. But you're not there. You're here, warm and safe, free to drift into sleep without fear of cold or hunger or storms, free to rest and dream and let consciousness go. The rhythm of your breathing slows, becomes the rhythm of snowfall, gentle and steady, covering everything with soft silence. Your body relaxes, releasing the day's tensions, sinking into comfort that those earlier generations would have cherished beyond measure, sinking and softening and letting go. Winter has ended in the stories and in your mind. Spring is somewhere ahead, bringing warmth and renewal, but that's for later, for tomorrow, for whenever you wake. For now, there's just this moment, this quiet drifting, this gentle descent into rest. The wind that howled across the prairie has become the white noise of a fan, soothing and constant. The cold that threatened lives has become the pleasant coolness of your room. The darkness that fell on sod houses and teepees and fort buildings has become the darkness behind your closed eyes, peaceful and unthreatening. You're safe, you're warm, you're far from those hard winters and the people who endured them. Their struggles are history now, distant and done, unable to touch you except as stories told in a quiet voice on a night when sleep comes slowly but surely. Let it come. Let consciousness fade like footprints in snow, gradually filling in until no trace remains. Let your thoughts scatter and dissolve like snowflakes melting on warm ground. Let everything go quiet, still, soft. The settlers found their rest eventually after winter passed, after years of struggle ended one way or another. The indigenous peoples found their own kind of rest, or are still searching for it, still navigating the aftermath of losses that can't be measured or repaired. The soldiers and officers and wealthy ranchers found their rest in different places, different circumstances, carrying different memories. All of them, regardless of their experiences or their outcomes, eventually came to the same quiet place where struggle ends and stories conclude. You're approaching that place now, that edge between waking and sleeping, where the day's concerns fade and the mind's constant activity finally stills. It's a small death, sleep, a temporary surrender of consciousness that your body knows how to do without your help or permission. Let it happen. Let the Dakota winters recede into history where they belong. Let the cold and the wind and the snow exist only in memory, in stories, in the gentle drift of words that carry you down and down into rest. The prairie sleeps under snow each winter, rests and waits for spring, patient and still. You can sleep that way too, patient and still, trusting that morning will come, that warmth will return, that this quiet darkness is temporary and safe. Sleep now. The stories are finished, the journey through history complete. Winter has passed and taken its dead and released its grip on the living. You're free to rest, to let go, to drift into whatever dreams or darkness waits. Sleep. The wind is just a fan's hum. The cold is just comfortable coolness. The darkness is just rest. Sleep. Everything is quiet now. Everything is still. Everything is soft and distant and fading into white silence. Sleep.